What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I said ancient Egypt? Some will think about the pyramids, others of a pharaoh, but most of you will probably think about an Egyptian god. And there is nothing surprising about it. These gods are one of the most iconic and famous elements of Egyptian culture. Most people never had heard of Djoser or Hatshepsut, but anyone is able to recognize Anubis, Osiris, Horus, among others. But what's more fascinating and fun to me is the fact that most people have no idea what an Egyptian god is. Schoolbooks, almost every time, try to follow the model of Greek mythology, of relating each god to an element, Ra, god of sun, Isis, goddess of magic, etc., etc. However, even for the Greek gods, this model is anachronistic. But I can understand why you are doing this. Explaining the nuances of Egyptian religion for an adult is already very hard. Most of you probably grew up with a strong influence of an Abrahamic religion, such as Christianity, Judaism, etc. Or with a rationalistic education based on scientific process. And despite its many differences, these two paths have something in common. Truth is often treated as unique. God exists or does not. If a sacred book says something, then this is the truth, and something is only true if it can be proven by science. But for the Egyptians, truth was not black or white. The gods, being beyond and prior human logic, had no obligation to follow it. I often say that the nature rules are like the waters of the Nile, changeable, impossible to hold with hands. They blend together while guarding their individuality. One god can be immortal and die. Two gods can unite in a single divinity and remain distinct at the same time. Horus participated in his father's funeral even before being born. And despite this confusion, Egyptian religion fascinates us. Every day, hundreds of artists create new interpretations of the natural. People try to find in Egyptian culture the origins of their religion, even if this does not make much sense. And there are even some, me included, who are trying to adapt the ancient Egyptian religion to our modern world. It is thanks to Egyptian mythology that I fell in love with this civilization and history, and to try to honor these gods, I decided to make a series of videos on them. However, as I explained it at the beginning, most people don't know what an Egyptian god is. So, before talking about each one individually, we must try to answer this question without an answer. The Egyptian word more often translated as god is Netjer or Netjeret in feminine. But this translation is not entirely correct. Until today, no one has managed to find the etymology of the word, but we know that it is also used to describe things that are not gods, as kings, famous figures, legendary creatures, and even hieroglyphs. The gods were powers that controlled the universe and are the guardians of its balance. Their true nature and appearance is beyond human comprehension. The Egyptian text described their deities always by having tens, even hundreds of different names, most of them kept in secret.
No one actually believed that Anubis was a man with a jackal's head.
This was a way of visually representing an aspect of the god that mortals could understand. Indeed, even the name given to the gods were not their real. For example, Thoth is the Greek name of the god Djihouti, word which simply means Tet of Djihut, Djihut being an Egyptian gnome. This is why the Egyptians had no concern in uniting two different deities, such as Amon-Ra, Sobek-Ra, and Serapis, always believing that these gods were individuals entities. Different gods could have similar attributes that could be honored as a god apart. This also explains why we know of 4 different versions of a cosmogony, but there were no conflict or war to prove which one is the true one. The view that there is only one absolute truth to which we are all subjected did not exist, and personally I find that in this aspect the Egyptians were wiser than us. Another curious detail about the Egyptian religion and other polytheistic beliefs is the fact that even the gods can die. The best known case is Osiris, murdered by his brother, but he is not the only one. Sacred text describes that the sun god Ra dies every night to be resuscitated in the morning. A famous passage in the text of the pyramids is the cannibal hymn, where the gods are described as, well, food for the kings. And in the Book of the Dead, there is a declaration that decline and demise await all gods and goddesses. The Egyptians even had their version of the end of the world, where not even the gods could escape. In the text of the sarcophage, Atum, creator of the universe, announces that one day he will destroy all that was created, and only he and Osiris will remain. However, before asserting that the Egyptians did not believe in the immortality of the divine, let's not forget that for them, death does not represent an absolute end, but a part in a cycle. Before life, there is death, and after death, there is life. As I mentioned earlier, Ra did die every night, but also was reborn every morning. Concerning the end of time, curiously, historians do not speak much about this passage. But I personally wonder if the inclusion of Osiris as the only surviving god is not an indicator that the universe, as well as the god, will be reborn. The Egyptians had hundreds of different gods. However, it would be an absurd to believe that every peasant worshipped all of them at the same time. Most of the deities were only worshipped locally. Each city had its own pantheon. Over time, certain gods became so popular that they were worshipped in many cities, and sometimes even in other cultures. Certain gods became patrons of dynasties. Amun gained much popularity and influence thanks to the 18th dynasty. And at the 19th, the one of the famous Ramses II was known by his predilection to the god Set. the Egyptians will gain the habit of organizing their gods into groups. The first being trinities, which, unlike the Christian, represent three isolated individuals who together form a family. The most famous was that of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, but there are others like Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu. An fascinating detail is that in the Dendera triad, where you have Horus, Hathor, and Ihi, it is Hathor, the mother, who has the role of head of the family. Another common habit was to reassemble deities in groups of 9, forming the Enneads, who are seen as the primordial gods who created the universe. Other groups of 4, 5, and other numbers also existed, but they are very rare. Unfortunately, we don't know why the Egyptians liked the number 9 so much. Speaking of the relationship between gods and mortals, this will vary a lot from period of time and to deity to deity. The general idea was that the great cosmic gods, such as Geb the earth and Nut the sky, were indifferent towards humanity, while other gods could directly interfere in the life of mortals, whether their cult was respected or not. The temples were closed to all who were not priests or members of the royal family. The only opportunity that the population had to approach the sacred relics were festivals and processions. However, this does not mean that the population had no access to religion. Each house had altars for making offerings and prayers. Amulets with sacred symbols were common, and some temples had public altars outside where the common people could make their offerings. Some gods, like Ammon, were known to hear the prayers of all their supplicants, regardless of their social rank. Another important detail is that the Egyptians had no problem in adopting foreign deities like Kadesh and Anat. But most of the times, the Egyptians assimilate the other deities with local ones. Of course, during the 3,000 years of its history, the Egyptian religion will change. However, this is a subject that we will cover in other videos. This one is already very long. But before leaving, I must make a correction. In this video, I categorically state that Akhenaten did not invent monotheism. And, to make it clear, contrary to popular belief, Akhenaten did not invent monotheism. I say that because my two main sources were against this idea. However, while I was researching for this video, I realized that until today, there is a great debate among the Egyptologists whether Akhenaten's reform can be reconsidered monotheistic or not. To state with certainty that this is the case, as many people and books do, is wrong. But to assert the contrary, as I have done, is also incorrect. I will explain the Atonism better when I get to Akhenaten in my main series. But for now, I apologize for my mistake. Anyway, here is my attempt to quickly explain this complex subject. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments. And if you want to tell me which divinity you want to see in my new series, don't hesitate either. May Ra light your way. Senebti.